we go again. I am joined by, of course, the infamous and famous I am Deep State. How are you doing today, sir?
Good. It's been a very eventful ride for Deep State over the last few weeks.
No, exactly. I can only imagine. There's so much for us to kind of jam on. I want to chat on paradigm shifts. I want to chat, of course, on Doge, not the token this time around, but of course the Department of Governmental Efficiency. And I also, want to chat on something you and I have talked a few times inside, and also deep state role in, let's say, new asset classes like digital currencies and crypto and so on. But with all of that kind of said, let's just start at kind of the beginning, because I think when most people hear deep state, first of all, just the word sounds like it's the epitome of nefarious, like, something boiled out of a North Korean camp or something like that. So the first question I'd love you to postulate on is deep state good or bad?
It can be both and neither. But what I would say, it's absolutely necessary, even in a country that is not a power, a great power. It's necessary in any system where you need governance. You need a form of governance to make your daily lives work. That's from collecting your rubbish, sweeping your streets, and making sure that your electricity works. And then you would think deep state is a crude, medieval, modern, early 19th century institution that's crude and needed as a crude way to keep power. But actually, in a modern economy, in a modern technology society, with all this talk of decentralization and how technology provides freedom, and we all remember the 1984 Apple ad where the guy ran into the meeting of the so called dictatorship of the proletariat, the commissars, the vast meeting hall, and threw a sledgehammer at the 1984 screen, right? We all have those hopes, and you can see in that ad it symbolized the hope of technology and freeing the individual from the man, from the matrix. But actually, in a very high technology society, which we are constantly evolving more into, you need a strong governance in order to provide the foundation for that to work. As I say, we're not here to practice technology, we're here to protect it. Quite a contradiction, just like saying we had to destroy the village to save it. But that's the
And
condition
again,
of man.
yeah, yeah, and again, for maybe some of the folks who maybe are hearing us go back and forth for the first time, you want to just kind of rephrase your definition at the very least of, what is again the deep state?
Well, the deep state is a collection of entities, a collection of interlocking cooperative governments of people in a bureaucracy who have as a vested interest the survival of government.
Yeah, and why do we
And
need bureaucrats? Why do we need these folks, or do we need them?
well, we need them because we can't have a plebiscite or a referendum every time you want to take serious action. They work hopefully and supposedly within a large framework in order to further the survival of a system. In the case of the US, it's not the imposition of US government per se on other countries, but it's the rules based Western order, of which the US is a dominant leader, and all those rules within the system. And people may not like those rules, like WTO and the need to reciprocate free trade, but just pull out your ATM card and credit card when you go buy your kids ice cream. That entire system, if you ask anybody in finance, the accounts, that whole banking system of managing your wealth, your cash or lack of wealth, it's an American system. No bones about it. We don't exist in the medieval age where Kay, you live down in the village. You live in a village 20 miles away from me, and I really don't like you, and we just kind of just don't have to interact and have no interaction with each other. Maybe we share the same river, okay? But we don't even have a road to each other, okay? That doesn't exist these days. There's a not so invisible linkage between this global trade system, finance, and economics. And when people say BRICS is going to decentralize or make their system, let's say, even mutually exclusive from the rules based Western order, because yes, the fact is, all those BRICS countries' economies are now bigger than the US economy. When Bretton Woods started, the US was, after World War II, the largest economy in the world, even if you grouped all the other ones following before it. No doubt, after the war, the US was the only intact economy. But since then, What's happened is that the other economies, through the US rules based trading order, have improved their infrastructure and grown
Yeah.
tremendously. And I think, as we discussed in the other show, that was more designed for the US deep state's security reasons, in that they couldn't police this world order on their own. The only way was to make everyone part of a mutually beneficial economic system, which they have done
Yeah,
with
this
BRICS. So
was Deep State 2.0, if I recall you saying, because I just think definitions are just very important so people,
yes,
understand what we're kind of discussing. Right? And I saw this definition of colonialism, which was very much, I think what you said was Deep State 1.0, which was this like, we're there, we're extracting resources, and it's also very resource heavy to maintain that power. And 2.0, as you said in a previous jam, which we will link, was more like imperialism, where you now also have soft power play, you now also have trade, you now also have, hey, join the club, these are the benefits. And by the way, if you don't join the club, these are the headwinds, right? At the end of the day, which is
yes,
that we operate in now, with the tip of the spear of that being the US of A, right?
yes. And basically, now you have all the BRICS countries having a bigger economy, or let's say more trade amongst each other than the US. But a lot of people don't forget, without drilling down this as a separate topic, a lot of people don't forget that trade doesn't exist in its own economic right. It's undergirded, supported, and made possible in this modern age by modern day finance, right? Your ability to hedge, your ability to transfer
Segue to
money,
that
and
later.
all that, in order to make the system work in an efficient and a compliant way, and a way that's safe for you and I. So, all these complaints I hear from BRICS, honestly, it's like, okay, you and I live across the street from each other, okay? And we had the same size house. And then you got really rich and you own 4 homes and you've got like 6 cars, a Bentley, a Lamborghini, and I'm still in my one home here, doing much better. But I'm kind of, and let's get to the bottom of it, I'm really envious of Kay, okay? And, as we know in the Bible, envy, greed are one of the 7 deadly sins, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of what I see is envy. They're upset that America got there first, and this system is one, despite its problems, and we can certainly see that and go into that at another time. Despite its problems, it works. So that's basically a kind of ongoing theme for today. How does it work, right?
I'm just thinking it again, just so we don't get off track. But if we go off the reservation, that's all well and good. A few analogies kind of come up to mind. So I really think that, so many of these social constructs, red, blue team, labor, conservatives, and the governance of the underlying people, so much of it is just bollocks, and it's just segregation. And I'm not a big fan of any form of segregation. I think a lot of the issues that stem in the world today are where you had a lot of people in power, and by a lot I still mean it's the few elite, right, overseeing the majority, and who have tended to make over time decisions that are more weighted towards themselves and their close tribe, right? And just lose the plot. And you summarize this very well in the RTHK interview that we did a week or two back, or whatever it was, where like how the Dems, as an example, completely kind of lost the plot. And you've seen this in many kind of other kind of countries. But I think the underlying issue globally, not just let's say in the US, but Europe, we even have it in Hong Kong, Singapore, we've talked about. There's two camps. There are those with assets and there are those without assets. And the reason this has become important is because, of course, inflation, right? Because if you have assets, then you at least have a hedge through inflation. But if you don't have assets, you're solely relying on an income, assuming that you are working. And that's what really kind of drives envy, if you're thinking about it. If you could pay the bill and vacation and still have a really good lifestyle, like you can kind of enjoy it. But if you're struggling and maybe you're working 2, 3 jobs, and the person across the street is pulling up in their fourth Ferrari, of course you're gonna get upset, right? Whether it's fair or not is besides kind of the point. It can't go on forever.
That cuts to what Marx had described as an economic genius about the end game of capitalism, that whoever owns the means of production, right?
Yeah,
Whether you call them the bourgeois or the elite, controls the economy and controls life. In Marx's case, it was land. Today, it's not necessarily land.
yeah, but it's assets at the end of the day, still, right?
Yes, it's some
It's
form
some
of
form of
assets.
asset,
You're
right?
correct. Right, whatever is the most economic powerful.
Yeah, and the
And
problem here is none of these things are true in society. There is actually very few examples of like capitalism. I think like the U.S. is more like crony capitalism, Probably the only place that's really truly competitive is maybe the valley, right? And even that has its own structural kind of inbreeding program that's been going on for decades if you're in kind of the boys kind of club. And as soon as you get into other stuff, there's like ring fencing within states. There's great examples of to get a hairdresser degree, and then you can only set up shop within 20 miles of another. So there's all of these actually very, very bloated ways of, it is capitalism at, let's say, the top, but actually the true expressions of it. In the case of the US, there's still enough value and growth being created that I think people mistake that for symmetrically flowing down into everything else in the US. And that's actually just not true at all, right? There's a lot of monopolies, there's a lot of moats, there's a lot of very, very kind of strong kind of incumbents where it doesn't matter what talent you bring or kind of what money you kind of bring, you just can't win. But that's a little bit of like a side tangent. But at the same time, if we, let's say, bring it down a level, we've talked about kind of deep state as a whole, meta, defined it. It's the bureaucracy, it's the admin, it's the operation. Someone's got to make a decision, but more importantly, people have to execute on that decision, right? So think of it as the piping and the operational side. If let's say you and I were doing a company, of course this is much bigger. And a sovereign is, the biggest company that kind of is. But also, what do you think about, let's say, the deep state now on a country level and the ones that you feel kind of get it right in regards to, like, let's say, sustainability of their citizens and their power and those that don't? Or is that even the right way of thinking about it? Or is it just always them maximizing the interests of the sovereign first, i.e., maintaining power, maintaining a going concern as a sovereign, and actually its underlying people is very much a distant second, if even that?
Well, you have to understand that this kind of, when people talk about sustainability and reaching some sort of end goal, that governance and the swamp, let's say, which deep state has turned into, is not about reaching an end goal because the whole sea of history roils like an ocean, in that it's never a one stable picture. There are always problems, it is constantly changing. I think to deal with this issue, let's dial back to the end of World War II and what the U.S. had as the sole surviving intact power was a sense of mission to prevent these kind of cataclysmic, all-encompassing wars that are hugely wealth destroying. So the people that originally formed what you call deep state, and people from after World War II, State Department, CIA, World Bank, IMF, originally started with this huge sense of mission to help improve the world, to fight communism, which was seen as the sole threat then at all points, and to use and to spawn different institutions in which to fulfill that role, institutions that are both within the US government and also outside and supranational to the US government, such as IMF World Bank Group, right? Those are all very important foundations of the swamp because they provide tools for the swamp to do their job. And as I've said earlier, to quote Russell Crowe from his movie The Commander, he says when someone complains why he is subjecting one of the sailors to a lashing for brushing by an officer, he said this, and he said, "All men must be governed, albeit badly, but governed nonetheless." And he means that without that, you don't have order, and the whole ship and complement fall apart. And really, the purpose of deep state is to prevent disorder. And it fully realizes its order is not necessarily fully orderly or perfect
Yeah.
or nice.
Yeah.
But you need order, and you can only have reform and changes, and you and I can only deal with our problems within an order: legal system, financial system, stability. Because I have worked in countries where you have none of that. And almost everyone, unless they've worked in these countries as a diplomat or as International Red Cross, as Médecins Sans Frontières, some sort of NGO or government person, you don't realize how bad and how horrible situations are without order. So,
It's like utopian. Oh, you're free to do whatever you want. No, you don't want that, right?
no, there are enough
Most
books out
ways.
there. There are enough
Exactly.
science books out there which show that science fiction and otherwise, that show what happens to men and women who don't have order imposed on them for their daily lives. So that's really the starting point of a deep state. It's not necessarily mendacious, but it's imposing an order
Yeah.
in all aspects of our lives.
So that's great. So before we maybe get into kind of Doge and of course, this new administration that we're going to be seeing, which we could talk to days about. I think you and I agreed that the potential is the best we've ever seen. They've been dealt the best cards ever. There's a very, very exciting team and roster, if you will. Also, great to get some huge diversification in regards to just the age and experience factor compared to overall kind of Congress as a whole. And that's all kind of well and good. But before we get into kind of Doge and the challenges and just how hard it would be to clean up the swamp, what do you think about, let's say, paradigm shifts, like, for instance, when empires rise and fall, right? So, for instance, when you had the shifting of the guard that is commonly agreed as, from the British Empire to the U.S. Empire, so Pax Americana, of course, before the British, it was kind of seen very much in the Dutch's hands. What happens to, and you and I discussed about the Rothschilds, and I was saying, like, it's just incredible, like, this family dynasty has managed to survive so many hugely structural volatile issues over time. But what happens to the deep state in some of this form? Because I can imagine if you and I are powers that be within a deep state, and we're working predominantly entrenched in country A, but the puck is moving to country B. What happens in a situation like that? Is it already extended there? Does it already have roots and tendrils? Or is there something more kind of dramatic in regards to the shift? How should one think about that? Am I even thinking about it kind of the right way, or what? Or I
Shifts
guess
in
even
power.
differently, is a deep state just one thing? Because I'm assuming that there would also be deep states that are very much catered to, well, we're championing China because we're from China, or we're championing India because we're from India, right? We're championing Europe because we're from Europe. So that's kind of, I guess, what I'm trying to kind of ask. When you have these big structural shifts of power, what happens in instances like that to the deep state, and maybe even like the USSR to Russia is something interesting that we could also chat on if you have a view of that as well.
These shifts in power throughout history, whether you call them alliances, deep states, and an alliance is always a precarious collection of deep state interests. All of them, when they shift or collapse or enter into conflict, highly dangerous points in history. And looking back, one can see whether as individual deep states like the Dutch were, the Spanish were, and the British, or a collection of colonial powers, pre-World War One Europe, for example, right? You have a very dangerous situation when you have this huge shift in power, because a shift in power usually results in military conflict.
Mhm.
One country does not become a deep state or a group, as in, let's say, pre-World War One. In the event, in pre-World War One, you had a unique situation of the rise of the German, Prussian, and also the Turkish deep states, right? But in any case, none of them actually become powerful without being especially authoritative in its exercise of power. What I'm trying to say is, you don't become a global power by being meek and not defending it viciously, which we have seen in history. So the reason, I guess, you're getting at why, how, when, and why does a deep state fail? First, just as a quick recap, you have to recall, what is a deep state, and what is a power actually, right? And the power actually resides today now in multiple levels: military, economic, political,
Yeah.
industrial, financial, technological, right? And the US pretty much dominates all of that. And they all interplay together to create tools and levels on which you can dominate the prevailing economic systems and and political systems that work in the world today. But yes, I think moments when you have a true shift in deep state usually lead to war. I mean, besides all the revolutionary wars in Europe, I think World War One and World War Two were certainly cases of apocalyptic conflicts between the deep states of different ideologies.
Yeah.
Before those explode, and all deep states, and as you can see, one of the issues of the current election was to stop the next World War III, because all states, especially powers, know that war is wealth destroying. The $50 billion a year spent on Ukraine could be spent towards rebuilding Ukraine. That's an
Yeah.
easy example, right? And also rebuilding Russia. Both
Yeah.
sides
And,
know that.
and it's a lot more
So
than $50 billion, by the way. But
yeah, it's a lot more. Okay, but I'm just
yeah,
saying for
I
that.
think
That's
the official figure is well over 100. So we all know the real figure is much higher. But go on.
sure. But let's just say the official figures for the amount of arms and
Yeah.
munitions sent. Okay,
Correct.
but
Yeah.
that can all be spent. And if you have an outbreak of war into Western Europe, well, the cost is astronomical, right? So deep state governments, I use them interchangeably, seek to prevent those, because once they get started, they're hard to stop and they're wealth destroying. I'd rather, as I've said in previous broadcasts, have you as part of our rules based order,
Yeah.
right? And you will benefit. You will get credit cards. You will get access to financial markets. And if you don't want to, unlike a colony, I'm not going to send boats over and seize your productive assets and install a puppet government. It's not worth the waste of money to do so. I'll just, at your very worst, like North Korea, I'll just isolate you,
Yeah.
right? Visa and Amex can't operate there. Those are straightforward, simple examples. They can't operate there. Computer companies can't sell the technology there. It's easy. We just cut you off. And one argument I get about a lot of people, well, the U.S. didn't win the war in Afghanistan and Iran and Iraq. Your idea of winning wars from the deep state modern governance point of view is not Roman Empire medieval idea of winning a war, which you erase all your buildings, do a genocide, extinguish your race and tribe, and
Surrender
burn
or
down all your
you know.
temples. It's
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
in the modern day just cutting you off from the system. We don't need you to issue a surrender. We just cut you off from the system, and you are no longer trouble to any of us. And as far as the security realm, one interesting strategy and tactic the Americans used in Iraq and Afghanistan that they actually copied from the Romans was that the Romans found out in let's say in Judea that it was too costly to have a general occupation. So they confined the Roman legions to forts, and they came out and dealt with you, attacked you, suppressed any uprising on a on an ad hoc basis, but stayed in forts in general, and that included, like, the fight for the Masada,
Mhm.
right? So that is far more economical way to exercise security over a troublesome region. That's what the Americans did in Afghanistan and Iraq. They realized they couldn't patrol the streets. It's too dangerous. It's too much a commitment economically in terms of troops. So we stay in our forts, and this time, unlike the Romans, we have helicopters. So we can move around and do whatever we need to do to maintain security, and at the same time control governance over the region until we transition to local governance.
But let's just take a step on kind of that back because, like, that decision to engage with Iraq, which we now know was spurious at best. There's the very famous plea made to U.S. Congress, and I believe it was from a young girl who was supposed to be from diplomats of Kuwait, and it ended up being it was all a big act. And that she was basically testifying how she lost everything and so on and so forth. Of course, the U.S. then got involved in Iraq. They got involved in Afghanistan. Like that initial decision to me seems like all the things that end up being wrong with the deep state because you know none of this was necessarily challenging in any which way the overall kind of power of the U.S. Right? What's your thinking or your kind of rationale there? Now I can see where Dick Cheney and his cronies made tons of money, of course. Like I see the logic from their side, right? Kind of heads they win and tails the taxpayer loses. But how do you yourself, coming from that world, having been in that world, think and kind of view that. And of course, taking Cameron, famously from the UK, as well as a whole bunch of other kind of people and the whole kind of Team America.
Well, this is where we split on how we see deep state, and how
Sure.
someone from inside versus someone from outside, which is rest of the world. I would use a Henry Kissinger argument to explain why it was very necessary for a deep state to enter and to sort out Iraq. It's this: it was a war of national prestige. It was absolutely necessary after 9/11 for a great power to show that no country, no group, no terrorist organization of a group of people sponsored or sympathized by any other countries could attack the US
Sure.
in such an open and brazen way. There would be a price to pay. Many will die, right? The US is not the Netherlands, it is not Norway. It doesn't go to the world court and say, look what happened to us, and we're morally outraged. This is a global
Sure.
power, and historically, all global powers need to maintain their great power control over a number of levels. So Iraq was very much necessary for that. And as well, since the U.S. was already in Afghanistan, troops were already on the ground. Since they had experience from Gulf War One, they were quite ready for this. And also, an attempt to remake the entire picture, that is, economic global energy picture in the Middle East, required that rogue regimes like Iraq, who benefited from oil, needed restructuring. We're seeing the same problem with Iran now, except that the U.S. has a very effective proxy and other tools to do that work. But Iraq was a war of national prestige, and again, quoting Kissinger, the U.S. public can only deal with two kinds of wars: very quick wars, like the invasion of Grenada by Reagan, 3 days, or apocalyptic wars, the war against Nazism and Imperial Japan, right? Where you can frame it in terms of true life or death consequences. But in between that, up to Iraq and Afghanistan, it was questionable whether the American public and political entities would deal with this war. But what was incredible about those long wars, which the American public actually dealt with and could handle, was that you had a major financial crash, 2008, in the middle of a two country war, which the U.S. government, economy, deep state actually survived. Most countries who are overstretched in terms of war, like Rome, for example, and like a whole bunch of city states in history, simply run out of money and collapse. Especially once you have a financial crisis, and your banks are threatened with complete collapse and failure. But the deep state in the U.S. pulled it all together and managed to reform quickly, and at the same time redefined what is war. And as I said in my earlier remark, redefined the definition of what is winning in a war and what is losing in a war, and what are the objectives of war.
Yeah, yeah. And listen, I'm also aware that this information intelligence we don't get, and so on and so forth. And also, as you rightly said, the deep state also understands that it's not going to operate efficiently. I suppose, just to me, from investor macro traders kind of head and just wired, it's estimated that just Iraq, Afghanistan, and kind of what they've been doing has been over $8 trillion. For context, that's close to a third of the GDP today. So all I could kind of think about is like, well, okay, what else could they have done with that $8 trillion? I appreciate that's also just spending out, and you would argue that what you don't see as easily is maybe stability that brought in other kind of parts of the world, or the deterrence that it maybe brought, or the also continued kind of trade, not to mention just also signaling that we're still the biggest gorilla in the room by far, right? But I feel like a
Well,
lot.
at the root of your point again is a difference between how one who works in the financial markets outside the system versus
Sure.
someone, as I said in an earlier discussion with you, works as a gnome at the
Bring
bottom
in the
of the lake.
perspective of money, because that will blow people away. Like, you had a very interesting take.
Yeah, and it's very hard to to discuss with normal people the very truth of what is money. And let's take your example of the 8 trillion spent on those wars. Well, the idea of that was we needed, as you pointed out, government and the system needs to survive, right? And adapting to your idea of a utopian system, as the communists have proved, has been too dangerous and actually has failed, because the journey kills you. It's as if the surgeon says the procedure was successful, that the patient is dead. Deep state seeks to keep the patient alive and avoid these risky surgeries like communism, which is to say we're all going to have this perfect world if you give up your individual interests. Okay, if you give up your money, I control the money and I control distribution of all economic means of production and benefits. Sounds really great. That's why communism is so romantic, and so many men and women fell in love with its cause. And in the 20s and 30s, there were so many people who thought it would bring in a perfect world, especially in the middle of the Great Depression, right?
Yeah, and there's people today in the U.S., right, especially on the blue side of the equation on younger demographics who
Yeah,
also.
they say to older communists, "Don't worry, we can. You did it wrong. We'll do it better. We'll do
Yeah,
it
exactly.
smarter, harder, and faster." Okay, you know, it will be better. We'll do it better. We have a better way. And they refuse to learn the lessons of history. Marx was a
Yeah,
genius economically. His observations of the end game of capitalism can be seen in Hong Kong, where you have a concentration of power that creates such disparity in wealth that you have social uprising. Unfortunately, Marx's prescription for that was, we can all agree, catastrophic, because tens and hundreds of millions died in this search for communism. Yet the search continues, and you can see in the young generation in the United States who believe in Marxism and some sort of dictatorship of the proletariat, and the evils of capitalism. And that's a constant struggle that people who believe in capitalism and the deep state must always remember. So,
yeah,
to get back to your earlier question, yes, the big problem of deep state, and you look at the abuses in the Iraq and Afghan war, and I don't disagree, there are abuses that arise from that, because war is a very blunt instrument. I think best, I was texting with a friend of mine who is with one of the three-letter agencies, and he said the problem that the CIA and FBI developed, especially post Iran Iraq war and then during the Obama administration, was that its senior ranks and top ranks got populated with lawyers rather than actual functional officers,
yeah,
who did the work in the field and stayed in their lane, because their work is federal law enforcement, their work is intelligence gathering. They got populated with lawyers who started thinking in terms of policy, and then who started thinking in terms of how to use this for lawfare, and how to bolt on the Department of Justice and the legal system and the intelligence gathering system to perpetuate their version and the deep state and swamp. And that is the problem: serial abuse and chronic abuse that goes on in the deep state today. We can see that. The American voters have seen that and voted against that in this recent election. They want this cleaned up. That's 90% of most conspiracy theory sites, which now blame everything up to weather and global warming on the deep state. And the deep state needs to reform itself in order to earn back trust and to do its quiet mission, which, as I said to you, is to be working on the supply of water and health at the bottom of the lake, not at the top of the lake.
yeah. Yeah, yeah. So listen, that's a great segue, and I'm just going to share my screen here. And just as I opened up my X, you can see there's this thing that's just been left by Elon, and he's posted it. It says, "Breaking: Internet stunned after an attractive biological female human of healthy weight wins Miss Universe pageant," which is fantastic. But what I really wanted to talk to you is about, of course, this Doge, not the token, but the newly formed Department of Government Efficiency. I hope this is formal, real. You always got to be a little bit careful on X, but I think this is probably the legit one as a whole. We have here, of course, the announcement from Trump you know, it's going to be headed by the great Elon Musk and Vivek. I believe Elizabeth Warren had a quip like, "Oh, great, two bosses. It's already inefficient from day one." And of course, his response was, "Well, we're actually not getting a salary from this, so yeah, it's already very efficient from day one." But all of that kind of aside, one of the key tasks, at least from my understanding, is going to be basically efficiency, looking for accountability, looking for bang for buck in regards to where American taxpayer money goes, right? And hopefully it will also go one way where it's not just about necessarily cutting and tightening kind of the belt, but also maybe saying, hey, this is really working over here. Let's channel some more funds in. Now, I think a lot of people have kind of approached this new administration coming in very kind of like linear, as in, oh, they're going to spend or they're going to cut, right? Kind of like any kind of classic administration. I'd like to think, though, that you and I agree that at the very least, the potential and the delta for things being very, very different this time forward is huge. And even if they just keep the same spending but increase the ROI on that spending, that's still a huge win for the American taxpayer, the American economy, and also ripples into kind of the rest of the world. I don't want to focus too much on the overall administration and what it's going to do. I just want to kind of focus on Doge as well as their task of looking to maybe combat the deep state is the wrong word because as we're saying here, there's an element of the deep state where you do need people in admin, you do need elements of bureaucracy, you do need someone to do kind of the piping, right? It's just a question of also the incentivization there, the transparency, the accountability, right? And at the end of the day, incentives kind of really run and drive the world. With all of that as a little bit of kind of a setback, and just for context for our listeners and readers, what would you anticipate are going to be the key kind of main challenges? And just maybe even before that, what was the overall thoughts when you just kind of heard about this? Was it kind of just, did you like keel back in laughter, or what were you kind of thinking as a whole?
Good question. Yes, I did reel back in laughter because I think the first quote that came to my mind was from Tolstoy, who said, and this is in the context of all the insanity of the Russian Revolution. He said, the only true meaning in life is that it's absolutely meaningless. And the reason I say that is not because I think life is hopeless. It's because there will always be a need for an administrative government, an administrative bureaucracy, in order to make our day-to-day lives work. And in order to get beyond that, if anyone argues, well, I just need my day-to-day life to work, right? I just need my rubbish to be collected, streets to be cleaned, right? Sewage to work, obviously. And by the way, during my stint at the World Bank, I have worked on hygiene and sewage, so I can tell you what a place is like that has medieval hygiene and
Yeah, you told me about the
sewage.
great Bill Gates
Yeah,
example.
people underestimate the importance of deep state and overestimate the grand conspiracy that's lined up against them. It makes great storytelling, and that gets back to what you asked about Doge.
Yeah,
It's a great piece of storytelling by someone who is a master at reality television, right? We need a narrative and we need a sideshow to engage and distract the public from the unpopular work that's going to have to be done. And the
yeah,
two people in charge of the sideshow, of Vivek and Elon, are really happy sideshow masters. They will use that to burnish their image. For Elon, obviously it's to make him complete his dream of being master of the universe. For Vivek, it serves his future political gains to have such a high profile role, which really has no power. They aren't cabinet
okay,
level roles. But Elon is in no position to take a government cabinet role because of his business interests. That's obvious. For Vivek, he needs more of a high profile role than a functional role where he is simply buried in the day to day of running a government portfolio, right? This is perfect for them, and they can run around and make all this noise. Whether they lay off hundreds of thousands of employees, who knows? But they'll generate a lot of good copy and content and tweets for the internet about the waste they uncovered. In the end, it's all it gets back to, as I've said, it's all just relatively minor amounts of money. The 8 trillion we spent on the war. I think you raised this in an earlier question. We could probably take this on in a whole separate show. You have to understand the concept of money for the deep state, for the government, is different than normal people. Money is just a
They just
concept.
print it more. That's how they think of
Yeah,
it.
it's just a concept. Just like in our past discussions over dinner and wine, do this as a separate show, but it's just a concept for them because the real objective is to maintain this standard of living and this order that we have. They will never actually infringe upon that because you have a lot of functions that governments do that, quite frankly, private sector guys like them won't and can't do, such as collecting your rubbish, sweeping your streets. These are jobs you can do, but you don't want to do, or the military that no one can afford to do. So you have to understand it's just a puppet show that they're getting ready behind the curtains for the children in the audience. That's all I
Okay.
see it. Yes, and they can make recommendations and put on, as I said, great demonstrations of moral probity and outrage. But in the end, a large power like the U.S. needs a very large administrative state that operates not only within the US but around the world. And I think US elections are largely about domestic issues. And one thing most Americans who live in the US don't realize
Hmm.
is the same thing that your average Roman citizen didn't realize. That actually Rome and America has a massive influence around the globe in many and almost all areas of life. And it's necessary to maintain a large administrative deep state in order to provide this great standard of living that we enjoy in the United States.
Okay, so two things, and the first one I'll say, but it could still be made more efficient naturally, right? It can still be made more transparent. It can still be made more kind of accountable from the context of
Oh
we
yes,
need to be
I think
more
those are all
transparent.
admirable issues. I think those are all admirable issues and counterweights,
Yeah,
because if you don't have what you have today, which is the administrative deep state, the CIA and FBI run by lawyers and being wielded as political tools, we don't need more efficiency. But you asked me about Doge and really what its purpose would be.
okay, so humor me a little bit because I kind of have, a little bit of the opposite view, and perhaps I'm naive, but at least I'm consistent in in that view and attribute, as I've always kind of been led to believe, and it's how I'm wired. I'd rather be optimistic and wrong than pessimistic and right. But let's assume that the pathway that I feel very excited about, as in this is the best cards ever that the American voters have dealt this new administration. Now they still have to play them well, right? If we had to, let's say, for Doge to be successful, what would you say one or two things that you'd recommend that they did? Let's say, for argument's sake, if you were an advisor, Elon called you up and said, I am deep state. We need someone on the inside who really understands this cancer. And we understand that, of course, you need bureaucrats, you need piping, but we need to get this kind of better. I mean, what would be kind of your top one to two things of what potentially they could do, maybe an area they could focus on? And I think even more importantly, just from a subtraction perspective, what are maybe one or two things that they should not do, right? Because this is the issues that we have in the US as well as everywhere else, have been decades in the making. There's not going to be a night and day overturning of everything, right? I think also it's something that a lot of people, who vote kind of also just fail to kind of realize. I think what's exciting to me is this may be way, way more than a regime of 4 years. When Vance was named vice president, he was 39, he's 40 now. We could literally have 12 years, right? We could have a Trump for four, Vance then run and have two terms. And that's exciting to me because it potentially means, at least hypothetically, that your chance of doing both short-term structural reform and long-term bigger structural reform that's kind of trickier is actually kind of possible, or at the very least the probability has never been higher, right? I think it's going to take quite a few cycles before the Dems even kind of get close to regaining any form of credibility and leadership, but we probably need some members of power there to just kind of literally die off or kind of resign. Like it needs a whole new rebirthing. But again, just taking it back to Doge, you've got the call. Let's just assume, for argument's sake, that you've chosen to serve. What's the top 1 to 2 recommendations you've given to focus on to do? Let's think of it as maybe low hanging fruit and not too complex. And what's 1 to 2 things you tell them? Whatever you do, don't even try doing this because it's just going to be a clusterfuck. Any thoughts just around that theme in general?
Well, my actions would be consistent with what I said about why Doge was formed in the first place, right? Sarcastically, I said it's a nice little sideshow and a brilliant tactic by the master of American reality television, right? It's a good method to show the American public that you can fully revolutionize or curb deep state. But if I had a key role, I would say that firing the excessive amounts of dog catchers and street sweepers are really not the show that Donald Trump is looking for. I also, as I said earlier, do recognize that deep state has caught itself a very malignant and chronic disease in its abuse of laws and administrative state against the people. And two of those are clearly in the FBI and in the CIA, where people there have told me there are just too many lawyers in our senior ranks that are interested in not only what the rank and file signed up to, but the early and true mission, which was law enforcement, intelligence gathering, and protection of national security by weaponizing laws and propaganda and fake schemes against Trump. That will be the biggest goal and challenge for Doge to deal with. However, I think for those specific challenges, Trump and the DOJ and the White House itself will directly deal with. The government efficiency side, there'll be a number of agencies that will probably resist any classic private sector type of efficiency initiative. It'll probably be military, although I would imagine in the bidding and the technology development process that Elon will have a lot to say about this. And he'll probably spin it in a patriotic style and position to advance national security. So that area is ripe for improvement. I think areas you can't touch is probably in foreign affairs, where a large infrastructure exists of bases. Let's say, for example, exists in order to advance American security and power around the world. Very inefficient, very costly, but necessary given the work that has to be done. But overall, I think both of those guys are very well spoken in media, which is why they're chosen to head those roles. It will be a very nice arena and a public relations tool for the White House to use for showing that they are fulfilling their mandate to help the American people and the American working class.
Okay. And your assessment, if you will, again, giving you years in the space, and also I'm not quite sure if you have any color to share from, your contacts in Washington and of course, other kind of centers of kind of power. But you think after 4 years, Doge is going to be more like a meh rather than kind of really anything kind of achieved for the structural better of a healthier and more efficient kind of deep state? Do you think it's just too big of a challenge, or do you think there is room for you to be pleasantly surprised?
I think there's always room for improvement, more transparency, less opacity, and better returns on the taxpayer's dollar. There's no doubt about that, but really not significantly much more room because deep state has to do functions which private sector can't do, but which are absolutely necessary for the function of government, for the protection of American power around the world, and ultimately the enforcement and reinforcement of the rules based order, right? Which, as you can see today, the success of Bitcoin, crypto ultimately depend on.
Yeah.
You have to be part of the system. The Your correct call on Bitcoin, uh, which I recognized and admired, was purely based on deep state integrating Bitcoin into the existing global order of finance. Purely.
Your thesis on that. I don't necessarily agree, but I think it's an interesting one to kind of share. But your view when we were in Hong Kong, and correct me if I'm wrong, but was that this is actually also been orchestrated on the deep state side. Can you just give people a little bit more one-on-one on the framework around that thesis?
Yeah, when they announced in January that Bitcoin would be allowed to be wrapped by ETFs by initially BlackRock and Vanguard, I said to you over dinner, the psyop is over. Okay? It's over now. It's done. It's succeeded. It's finished. Because certainly digital currency was a concept of the US government from the very beginning. In fact, I have seen in my time in Washington declassified NSA documents, and I believe you can probably find it if you search hard enough in Freedom of Information Act. But research papers detailing what they believe to be the benefit of a digital currency or and the beginnings of digital finance. That it would extend compliance, control, and power. So it shouldn't surprise you that there are minds thinking about this in the deep state. And really, when you think about it, the inventor who remains anonymous, mysterious to this day,
Yeah, is it AI? Is
yes,
it a woman? Is it a group? Is it deep state?
it's some sort of character out of the Matrix, right? You know, it's basically, if you step back, you can see this is a fictional cartoon character created to seed the thoughts of the people you needed first at that time in the early 2000s to perpetuate this concept called Bitcoin and digital currency. And these people were young teenage boys who couldn't get dates, who spent too much time in front of the computer, and were seeded with this idea that they could that although girls don't like you, you can dominate the world. Well, it ended up they still can't get dates, but they can't dominate the world. But some people made a lot of money, and you know what? Deep state's fine. It's just money, right? And some of you ran around, and yeah, I can ascertain. Yeah, some of you ran around and made a lot of money, bought lot of cars, act like fools. That's okay. Even did illegal stuff. That's okay. And got fame and fortune, but it fulfilled the psyop, which is once this dream gets a bit real, it becomes painfully real to everybody else, and everybody wants to chase the dream. So they get that going, and now the dream, Bitcoin, has become big enough, and it's big enough defined by a fiat currency, the US dollar, not big enough in its own terms. But it doesn't matter because if it's defined by US dollars, we have control over it, right? And then now, just like any PSYOP, they have to close off the loose ends. It wasn't a coincidence. November, FTX, Samuel Bankman Fried, right? You know, a guy I knew in Hong Kong. He got shut down, and so did Binance, right? They got shut down hard. Who did they get shut down by? Well, unlike what the crypto fanboy said, it wasn't the algorithm that shut them down. I think it was, if you a pretty easy read, it was somebody called Department of Justice, right? FBI. They shut him down. And that's classic for a psyop. They shut him down in November, convicted December, and basically that's called closing of loose ends. The guys who are just way too big and out of control and causing too many frauds. And as you and I know, the biggest problem with crypto, most of the frauds occur at the exchange level, right? Either at the moving from fiat currency into the crypto or from crypto back or custody. That's where most of the fraud occurs, right? And that has to be cleaned up. So you clean up the biggest player. That was sure quick. The psyop's over now. Now we have illegal players in who don't have to worry about the big illegal players, right? I mean, if you go look at the Department of Justice filing, something which a guy like me does, actually, you see a lot of crypto frauds. There's a ton of filings and complaints, right? So the currency is troubled, lacks opacity, and because of that, because of a lack of institutional structure, cannot truly attain its potential, which is way beyond just a crypto that you and I can trade with anonymity. There's much more to it than that. But the psyop got closed. The psyop got closed by January of this year. So now we move on to it as as a real financial instrument, and that's why I've been saying, just like you, it's going to keep going up and up and up. But people ask me, when does the upside stop? Well, a lot of people haven't thought that through. But as someone who worked for a central banking organization, I can kind of tell you. It stops when they run out of Bitcoin. When they got about 99% of it mined, okay? It's over because they can't make any more. So, for those of you who have your calculators out, figure that out. That's when the upside's over. Then the deep state is fully in charge of this as not a currency. They would never make it a currency, but as a fully controlled deep state asset using private financial sector entities. Sorry, go ahead.
No, no, no.
Sorry, your earlier question
No,
was
no, no.
Doge
I think
and
it's good,
its
right?
effect.
No, no, no. It was exactly, I wanted you to explain the thesis, right? And I think, what you and I both enjoy is we can go down many pathways. We can agree to agree, and we can also agree to disagree, right? And I wanted your kind of crypto panel conference in Singapore that I had the privilege of hosting. And, I think a lot of these things kind of jump straight into different tokens, different protocols, and they kind of do an injustice in my viewpoint because I was saying to the audience, at the end of the day, if the TradFi centralized fiat system worked really, really well in a sustainable manner, then there would have never been a need for crypto and digital assets. That's kind of the raison d'etre of why the Bitcoin white paper appeared, at least from my understanding currently today, and also my belief, of which I'm, of course, happy to kind of change. I think it's an interesting thesis that this was part of a deep state kind of plan to get people going to, let's say, comfortable with digital tokens, assets, and then also kind of currencies, because of course you get that much more control, right? If you can actually see people's underlying transactions, if everything is digital, than, let's say, cash, right? So appreciate you kind of sharing that. With all of that said, Mr. Deep State, this has been a phenomenal jam. We'll keep on going, and I'm sure in the next session we'll cover things in regards to highlights, wrap up of 2025, 2024, I should say, and thoughts on kind of 2025. Do you have any, let's say, closing thoughts, maybe to leave kind of the audience with? One of the things that you and I talked briefly about offline was Biden's last kind of 2 months. Normally, this is kind of the period where they hand out kind of the cookies, presidential pardons, so on and so forth. But one of the things that's really kind of seems a potential span in the work, and I think it's not being focused on enough in the kind of Trump euphoria and potential Christmas rally, is allowing U.S. long-range missiles to be used by Ukraine, which would be using it to fire in kind of Russian soil. Any kind of thoughts on that, as well as just anything else in general?
Well, just to close off, to address your specific question, Biden wouldn't have done it unless NATO and his military and all the military sources on the ground there were confirmed, right? And I think Biden wouldn't have done it just to leave Trump a major problem. It's a calculated leverage tool against Putin, who recently launched over 100 to 150 missile attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. So it's not a rash decision at all. I think it puts, and it makes Trump look good because you got to remember they both had a long meeting at the White House last week.
Yeah.
It helps set Trump up with a situation of plausible deniability. He had nothing to do with it, but since it's already there, just like with most presidents, they keep anything that aggregates and increases their power. And it's a leveraging negotiation tool with Putin that he can say he can stop that as part of a complete ceasefire, a negotiation package. So I think it's a positive development and timed for Trump to come in and to look like a peacemaker and good guy by ratcheting down hostilities and provocations.
Okay, awesome. Appreciate you as always, sir. Looking forward to our next jam, and we wish you a beautiful rest of your day and weeks into your end. All right.
Yeah, we will have yet another session where we try to sort this out for our listeners. As I said, I'm not a supporter of the excess of the deep states, but I seek to explain why it is necessary, it exists, and actually a lot of the benefits. And ugly as the deep state can be, I always say it's not a bad deal. You should actually take it for most average people. Thank you.